background. It's constant for the longest time.
Yeah, it's been difficult to find a good background actually, these days. I haven't, despite the fact that we've been doing quite a lot of online talks, I haven't found a good practice yet, in terms of room background.
I usually am in the garden, and I even teach in class over the gardens, but the time frame today is it's going to be, it's dusk heading to, so we had time for lighting.
Here, it's my first time in the office since March. Oh, I actually I don't leave the house at all, but I couldn't, to host that, I had to come here to have more, space and the internet. So I've been working from home since March, and just with trips to another home, but never in the office. So it's very nice to be here.
So if I do drop, just understand it's network, although I have talked to the telecoms company and said I'm online on the webinar, you better make sure my network is great, but it's part of doing this.
Better not upset you, Monica.
By example.
Without further ado, let me begin. Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. My name is Nagda Riz. I am a professor of economics and founding director of the Access to Knowledge for Development Center at the School of Business of the American University in Cairo. The center is now 10 years old, and this is our 10th annual workshop. We have a tradition of holding an annual workshop in person, but for obvious reasons, this year we are holding a series of webinars online in partnership with Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung in Cairo, the Cairo office, and we are very grateful for the support. I'll say more about that. Our webinar is titled The Digital Economy Post-COVID-19, Global Outlook and Local Contexts. The hashtag is A2K10. Before we begin, I'm just going to share with you a few logistics for our webinar. This is our first time. I've given several talks and participated in webinars, but this is our first time to host one, which is an interesting experience, so bear with us. So the webinar will be recorded. So I hope this is all right with everyone. It is, and we will share it after that online for purposes of learning and sharing our knowledge. Once we begin, we will mute everyone. Kindly stay on mute, and the camera is off for connectivity throughout the session. If you want to have your camera on, by all means, we'd love to see your face, but we will appreciate to keep the mute to make sure there is no echo. I can see Armando has joined, that's great. Please write your questions. We will be taking Q&A at the end of the session, but please feel free to write your questions as you go in the Zoom chat box, addressed to everyone, not privately to the speakers, just to everyone, and our team is curating the questions, or as a comment on the Facebook live stream. We also have a Facebook live stream, or tweet to the hashtag A2K10. Panelists are able to mute and unmute themselves, so when they are asked to speak for ease of facilitation. The duration is 90 minutes, 9-0. We are going on until 5:30 Cairo time, with 15 to 20 minutes the Q&A. I will ask the speaker, the panelists, to provide their answers to the questions. We have a set of 4 questions, in 3 to 5 minutes to leave time for Q&A in the end. If you will allow me, I will just say a few words about our center. Established in February 2010, we are a research center housed at the American University in Cairo School of Business, looking at issues related to knowledge, technology, and development in Egypt and Africa. Basically, we've done a series, a whole range of research on software, media, creative industries, online spaces, innovation, the digital divide, maker spaces, the gig economy, open data for development, artificial intelligence and inclusion, and you can, check our information. We are engaged in advocacy and policy advice in Egypt, with a couple of stories of success for open source strategy in Egypt and artificial intelligence strategy. We have a number of international and local and regional and international partners. We are active participants in the network of centers on Internet and Society, championed by Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. We are the North African hub of the Open African Innovation Research Network, Open Air. with partners from Cape Town, Kenya, and Ottawa. We're also the founding node of the Open Data for Development in the MENA region, the founding node, with partnerships with Birzeit University and other partners in different parts of the Arab world. We're partners with active members of the Access to Knowledge Global Academy, with Yale Information Society Project, part of the Fair Work Foundation network with Oxford Internet Institute, and partners with Cambridge University's Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. Locally, we are partners with the Academy of Scientific Research and Technology, the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology. We have done partnerships with Internet Egypt. This is our information. I will ask our team members to put up our slide. If you need to know more about us, follow us on Twitter, A2K4D, on Facebook, and the hashtag for this event is A2K4D10. We're grateful to the support of a number of partners, MacArthur Foundation, Richard Bartlett Gift, Canada's International Development Research Center, the Web Foundation, Uber, Academy of Scientific Research, and a whole others. But last but not least, and most importantly, this webinar is done with the generous support of Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung in Egypt. And I have Mr. Richard Brooks, who I will ask to say a few words, welcoming remarks, and we're very grateful to partner with Friedrich-Ebert. Richard, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Nagla, for this introduction. And I would just extend my welcome also on behalf of FES. And we are glad that this is not the first project we are having with A2K4D with you. And I'm already great and looking forward for the amazing lineup of speakers of today's event. Maybe just a few words about FES for those who are not familiar with us. FES is Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung, is a German social democratic political foundation based in over 100 countries with offices. And we here in Egypt, in our Cairo office, is working on the promotion of democratic values, social democratic values since 1976. And I have to say, for us, the topic of digitalization and the digital economy is quite new. But I think the topic of today's discussion is crucial for us as a social democratic foundation and for citizens. I mean, we live in times of radical transformation marked by digitalization, and these changes have huge effects on how we work, how we live, how we do economy. And yeah, they will have a tremendous transformative effect on our economies. And additionally, at the same time, we are currently seeing, we are globally hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, with, at the one hand side, a push for more digitalization. I think we all experienced this, and the fact that you as A2K4D are hosting this event for the first time, even though it's already the 10th, congratulations on this. Digital is definitely something which we are all seeing in our daily lives. But at the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely a slowdown effect on our economies with tremendous consequences for many persons. And these two developments come together is, I think, a very important context we are discussing, and we are having this webinar today. What matters to us as a social democratic foundation is that, and not only for us, but also for all citizens, is that this digital transformation is actually used, and it's not taken as a given, but it's seen as something which we can actually influence and we can shape, and we can use to foster our societies, our economies, to make them more democratic, but also more socially just. And this is, I think, at the core of our interest as a German social democratic foundation. And yeah, therefore we are glad partnering with you, Nagla. And I'm already looking forward to all of you speakers. And I thank you already in advance for being with us today, and looking forward for a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. So without further ado, I'm going to get to our session. Allow me to say a few words. We are all aware of what the pandemic has done to us, just pushing us into scenarios that we had anticipated to take place way into the future. So we are into this reality today. It has amplified and the significant role of digital technologies. So multidimensional concerns have come to light. There are, there are questions about the impact of digitization and new technologies and artificial intelligence on markets, production, consumption, education, labor, work, employment, skills, government operation, regulation, and other areas. There is an urgency. There is focus on how digitization affects economic and social well-being, and an awareness of the threats, challenges, but perhaps also opportunities. So in no other time has the relevance and importance of global and local perspectives been eminent. And we are really fortunate. Now it's time to turn to our speakers. We have wonderful speakers, perspectives from Africa, Latin America, and Western Europe, with expertise in law, economics, data science, management, and education. So allow me to very briefly introduce our speakers. They have by their bios, they're online. I don't want to take up time, but I very briefly mention who they are in alphabetical order. So we have Armando Gui Español, who's a fellow at Harvard's Berkeley Klein Center for Internet and Society. He's an expert in AI policy, data protection, and innovation. Armando comes to us from the field of law. He has a vast experience in advising public and private entities around the world. He's the author of the ethical framework for artificial intelligence in Colombia, part of the Presidential Advisory Group for Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation. So we have Armando from Colombia. And from Kenya, we have Dr. Monica Karetz Macau. Monica is the academic director and professor at Thunderbird's Center for Excellence for Africa. She's based in Kenya. She has a vast experience in management and education, and work with international organizations, the World Bank, UNCTAD, and others. But I think my favorite is that she has won several accolades, including top 100 influential Africans in 2017 and top 100 reputational Africans in 2018, which is super impressive. And last but not least, again, I say very briefly, our third speaker is Fabian Stephanie. Dr. Stephanie is economist and social data scientist at the Oxford Internet Institute, researching on platform economics. He's also with Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin. Fabian has been working for various actors in international policy landscape, such as World Bank, UNDP, OECD. I mean, these guys have tons of information on them online. I encourage you to look them up. I have put up the Twitter handles of our speakers, and also of FES, of A2K4D, and the hashtag A2K10. And without further ado, I'm just going to start into our first question to the speakers. And it goes like this. So far, we've been used to a common narrative for the digital economy. It has often been stated that digital technologies can be, on the one hand, can be harnessed for empowerment, growth, and development, but they can also aggravate digital divide and amplify inequalities, knowledge, developmental gaps between countries, within national boundaries, and in specific communities. This is the narrative that we have been witnessing in the past few years. Now comes COVID-19, and my question to the panelists is, how, if at all, has COVID-19 impacted, changed this narrative, the dual and indeed paradoxical potential of the digital economy, both globally and in your own context? And allow me, we start with Fabian. You're an expert in digital platforms. You've done tons of work on inequality and many other aspects of the digital economy. So we will start with Fabian to take the first question. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here, and even greater pleasure to be the first one to answer these questions. So let me quickly seize the opportunity to thank you, Nagla, and your center, as well as Richard and the Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung, who I believe are just a couple of blocks down the road, because I've been seeking academic asylum at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute in Berlin right now, which is in Mitte, and around Tiergarten is the Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung, I believe. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and have this truly international, really international panel here. Addressing your question, so maybe if I'm allowed to do so, I would just feed in a quick loop and make the example referring to your question with what we are researching on right now. So at the Oxford Internet Institute, for example, I'm a part of the so-called iLabor group. And what we do there, it's an initiative that's led by Finnish sociologist, economic sociologist, Professor Ledon Virta, The idea of the group was to make the unmeasured measurable, in that sense that when gig economies started to emerge, so when people started to utilize labor online, translating text, designing logos, or doing data science, researchers and policymakers were lacking official statistics, essentially, to monitor that. So there are well-established statistics for the on-site labor market, but there was little known about how to measure the activity of these gig economies. And that's the motivation of this group, and that's what they've been doing for the last 4 years and continue to do when I joined the team last year. And I think that the example of online labor markets is a good example to address your question, because you initially alluded to this, let's say, big promise of the internet, this internet tearing down borders, tearing down walls, unifying people around the world in what is most popularly known, as this global village. And the idea behind online labor markets is in a nutshell a similar example, because when initially people saw these online gig economies emerging, they thought like, oh, well, what a wonderful thing. Now there is this truly global unified market where people can exchange their work all around the world, and with a big potential for countries that are in the process of economic development to not only tap into this global economy, but also to have a potentially profitable job, and then on the side even learn some new skills and new experiments. So essentially a perfect, wonderful story. Though it turns out the more that we started to monitor this market, the more we got kind of a taste of the idea that this initial very positive narrative of the internet might not be as glooming as we actually thought that it could be. As an example, just recent figures from our main tool that we're referring to, which is the Online Labor Index, which is kind of a big indicator measuring the demand and the supply, the utilization of online work around the world. Data shows us that the demand for online work from the whole continent of Africa is only roughly 3% of the global demand for online work. Just to give you a perspective that unfortunately so far, at least when it comes to online labor markets, which is one example of the promising pathways that the internet could take, this story, this truly unifying story of the internet has not become reality yet. And maybe to come to the second part of your question, how did COVID impact that? I think a general theme that might be reoccurring, at least throughout the things that I'm going to say, but hopefully also, and I'm curious about that, what my colleagues on the panel are going to say, is that there is, at least for our research, there's a big trend that is motivating our work, that is facilitating all the changes that we see, and that is on the one hand, the fragmentation of things. So in our case, the fragmentation of work. So work can be broken down into smaller sub-pieces and sub-units. And then the digitalization of this, so the digital transferability of these little granular units. And these two trends, I may call them mega trends maybe, they have really paved the way for example, for the global gig economy, the online work economy. And just as a side note, when I say this, I refer to the platforms that we're looking at. So the work is performed online and distributed online. So I'm not so much, I know it's also gig economy, but I'm not so much talking about work that is performed on site. So I'm not talking about, for example, car drivers or people that are delivering food. But these two megatrends, so the fragmentation and the digitalization, they have really fostered these online labor markets and make them grow with all the potential, facilitations of negative imbalances that I just mentioned with the example of demand from Africa. And the fragmentation of work and the digitalization of these tags, of these little fragments, has, at least from my point of view, only been facilitated by the crisis, by COVID-19. For the simple example that we all, as we do right now, have to do what we do, or what we're doing right now, we do this online, we do this digitally. So though in pre-COVID time, there could have been the alternative that we sit together actually in a room, in a conference room and meet each other. But there has been an increased demand for exactly that, for digitalizing things that have been previously done online. And this, of course, also facilitates what is going on online labor markets. And the question is really, these processes grow, so they move forward, this fragmentation and digitalization, that's for sure. I think if I had to bet on this, that's definitely going to be the case. So digitalization will be promoted by COVID-19 and by the lockdown, the economic repercussions that come with it. I think the more interesting questions, and then I'll stop there for now, is will this process progress with the same speed for all parts of society? So geographically speaking, will this be the case for all regions at the same pace? And also even within regions, even within, let's say, economically prosperous places, maybe like the United States, within occupational groups or parts of the population, will it progress at the same pace? And this ultimately, I think, defines if this new facilitator of the dynamics that I mentioned, the facilitators COVID-19, if this really manages or will level out imbalances or further amplify the imbalances that we see in society in terms of distributing of knowledge, generation of income, economic inequalities.
Thank you very much, Fabian. This is super interesting. And my takeaway is the fragmentation and the digitalization and the chances of this actually aggravating inequalities. So let me move on to Monica. You mentioned the figure from Africa, the labor 3%. And Monica, you've done work on ICT for development. So perhaps you could jump in on this. Yeah, Monica, you're muted, sorry. Can you unmute yourself? Monica?
I haven't muted myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Fabian, for your comments. And I'm going to just say, I think just remember for Africa, when we think about technology, we really have to think about three levels that are sort of triplets: infrastructure, access, and costs. I think you can't sort of separate those three conversations in a sense. You might have infrastructure, but then access to it, fiber to home or access to home is another issue. And then of course, with the same thing is what is the cost of accessing the technology? So I really want to start by having that conversation from that framework. And also the second thing I want to highlight for Africa is that when we think about digital, we are talking about the fact that, GSMA report in 2020 highlighted that 477 million Africans in sub-Saharan Africa had subscribed to mobile services. That's a big number, 477 million in 2020. That's really high, at least, and by 2024, a billion. And so that's a big number we're thinking of. And of that billion, 50% hopefully are moving into smartphone. And so that's an interesting trend as well as we think about digital. Who is on digital? It's the smartphone. And that's for Africa, and that's the smartphone for 50% of Africa. And as well, when we think about how are people accessing smartphone, because I remember I said technology, access, and cost, we're beginning to see shifts in how technological companies are allowing access to smartphones. And so you're beginning to see interesting things. So for example, in Kenya and East Africa, you're seeing the mobile subscribers such as Safaricom, whose network I'm actually using. I need to say this, and I want to thank them a lot because I'm actually out in rural Machakos, which doesn't have fiber, and I'm using my mobile network to connect to you. So just attesting to the power of technology out and not in the city of Nairobi, but out in the county. But just to say, someone like Safaricom, for example, and Google have created access to mobile by having low costs being paid, in daily installments so that people can own mobile phones. That's new. That's a new mindset, new thinking, and saying, hold on a minute, how do we allow everyone to access mobile? I think I wanted to just highlight, that, and then as well highlight that who is accessing, who's in access, what sort of access? Is it 4G? We're still in Africa, if we're speaking about the whole of Africa, I mean, most of Africa is in 2G and 3G. But we hopefully, that people will move into 4G and 5G. And when we think about, in terms of internet penetration in Africa, we're talking about 39.3% of Africa in total being on the network, which is the lowest when we, compare with Asia and Europe, which is at 87.2 compared to Africa at 39.3. And even in Africa, when we sort of segregate that around countries, that even begins to change. So I think I wanted to sort of lay the framework on what we mean by digital in Africa, and really infrastructure, access, and cost, and how does that come about, and then of course the phone and the mobile. I want to talk about what COVID-19 has done and what you've just said, and I hope I'm not too fast. I'm trying to stick to my 3 minutes and time. So maybe just highlight the nature of work first, and maybe to say in regards to the nature of work, I really see two things happening. One is that the corporate sector in Africa has harnessed COVID. And I think you must give them marks for that. That has been interesting, that has been monumental, that has been different. We don't really always talk about the corporate sector in Africa. We tend to always talk about, the poverty side of Africa. And so I really want to highlight that the corporate sector in Africa has really done great. And we must commend corporate sector and the blue collar, companies for their work in many people working from home, harnessing Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all other sorts of technology. But of course, in the same vein, you cannot speak about the fact, you have to speak about the fact that there are millions who have had no access, especially those not working on blue collar jobs. And Fabian has highlighted that excellently with the work they're doing. So I won't really go into there, but we are really talking about a workforce that, is not proactively gonna be online because of their type of work. And we are seeing SMEs, especially small, medium, and scale enterprise companies, really changing their models of how they do work. If I think about the creative industry, I mean, as there's been a pause with the creative industry and, artists joining online. And I actually watched a play 2 weeks ago online. I couldn't believe that. A Kenyan, play done by fabulous women. So the fact is that there is a change in how the creative industry is running and thinking. You have Dunda Live, you have Mdundo, which are interesting creative places where audiences and consumers can actually log into. And I think that's going to be interesting. I also want to highlight the fintech or mobile money sector, because that's really had an impact in Eastern Africa, especially because while the banks were on slow, the mobile companies, especially those running mobile money, I want to talk about M-Pesa, Airtel, MTN, we began to see a big shift in the amount of monies they were allowing on your M-Pesa or mobile money wallets. That really changed over the COVID period. And also in terms of the wallet, the costs of transactions. So not only do they think about the amount of money you can hold, but when thinking about, the low end of the pyramid, they began to say, we are not going to charge any costs on, changing money. In Kenya, this was, up to 1,000 shillings. You could transact on mobile money up to 1,000 shillings without paying any mobile cost fee to it. And so that's, a big shift in terms of thinking through how do we think about COVID? How does that impact mobile money transaction? And if you actually look at the amount of transactions done during the COVID period in Eastern Africa, just stupendous. And really thinking about how people were accessing and transacting during this period, very interesting. The other thing I want to highlight, in the same vein as we had, the fintech sector, mobile money, M-Pesa, MTN running in Africa, we also had predatory lending practices happening, because digital obviously has brought in a lot of lenders who are able to say, why don't I lend you money in the mobile banks? And so we need to maybe watch for the fact that we have predatory lending practices happening, and we need to watch for what that means, because very many people will borrow money online, not knowing, the interest rates, or not knowing what this means for interest rates. I think I also want to move and sort of highlight e-commerce and maybe highlight Jumia, Kilima Q, Konga, Leap Delivery. I mean, we've seen online around, delivery, especially in the upmarket areas within the East African region, and even Southern Africa region, Northern Africa region, Nigeria, Ghana. You begin to see a lot of transactions around the mobile platforms in terms of transacting. And so that's interesting, especially during the COVID period. And so, a lot of credit to this companies that have been online and really, trying to get themselves online. I want to highlight Kenya, Mauritius, Namibia, South Africa, which really have the largest share of online shoppers in Africa, exceeding about 8%. compared to the rest of the African countries. So if you sort of look at transactions going on in these countries, you're seeing a lot of transaction happening. It's maybe looking low, but for Africa and for what we are going through, this is commendable. And I don't want to compare it. I just want to say this is commendable within the context that it is in at the moment. If I go into the education sector as I end this question, we all saw what has happened in Africa. A lot of students went on lockdown, including yourselves in Egypt, Nagla, ourselves in Kenya today. We officially opened yesterday, and we only opened to about 3 different grading systems in the country, which is the final year is in different grades, but the rest of the students are home. We saw private schools continue to exist and continue to run. And so what COVID did highlight was the existence of the economic divide that has been very strong. And we see that with COVID, because then those who could afford access to technology and afford to go online went online. And then we saw that majority of schools that could not afford to go online, and these are a lot of public schools, did not go online. And so this is a question we have to ask. But then we want to commend people like South Africa, mobile operators, Vodafone and MTN, who went ahead and zero-rated the cost of learning sites with extensive free content. That's commendable. And we must really credit that in terms of what they did. Nigeria also had, students, from, virtual through, radio, TV, and a lot of countries went into radio and TV. So I think interesting. We continue to see an interesting move. When we come to e-governance, we sort of are beginning to see moves around the same thing. I'm sorry for my headphones. I hope you can still hear me. And as I end, just to say, e-citizen portals, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya are looking into e-passports and are really having systems around thinking about cost on governance and systems. Let me stop there. I just highlighted a round figure about Africa. I think a lot happening. And I wanted to be on the positive side because we're always speaking. And I think there's good stuff happening. There's a lot of people not online, and we must accept that they are not online because of the question of infrastructure, access, and cost.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monica. I think it's important to highlight both sides of the story, and it's important to see Africa in a positive light. Thank you very much for this. I'm now going to move to Armando. Armando, I know you've done work on and you have an interest in how AI could be used for good in Colombia. I know you shared in our essay that you did in a series that we worked on how important there is a role for artificial intelligence, for technology now after COVID-19. So maybe you can take a moment to share a few thoughts. Thank you very much for joining us.
Sure. Well, thank you, Negla. Thank you, Richard. I'm very glad and honored to be here and with my colleagues, with Monica and Fabian. I think very interesting stories from all around the world and experiences that I think are worth mentioning. Well, the case in Colombia has been quite similar. So we have had experienced this same these same events. Of course, COVID-19 and the pandemic has also affected us, but it has been very interesting because it has shown us that our mindsets were changed completely. So it was more of a cultural change in the way that some years ago we were talking about the digital gap, how to reduce the digital divide, that there were a lot of inequalities. But at the end, only because of COVID-19, people realized, I think, and especially in the region, that this was a serious matter, that actually we require some changes, that connectivity, digitization, access to internet, and all these things were relevant and important for the region and for all people in the country. So here we have a very big digital gap. So we have countries, parts of the countries and a population with 5G connection, and another part of the country that has no connectivity or no connection at all, or very, very slow connection. And that's something that we have been struggling for the last years, but finally this year, I think we realized how important and relevant it was to build a change. So I think that was important for us. And at the same time, we start looking, and as Monica mentioned, more and more into emerging technologies and how could emerging technologies provide solutions for our countries. For example, so we have e-wallets, fintech solutions that start being developed in the country that help us a lot. And artificial intelligence also started looking into a way in which we could build some solutions, blockchain, many other things. But the problem was that, okay, we're using a lot of technology are giving us solutions, but we are still lacking like trust. People trusting these technologies, people actually believing that these technologies will change their lives, and at the same time that they will not feel, and that's a feeling that we have here in Latin America a lot, feeling replaced by technologies at the same time. So there was a challenge there, and we said like, okay, we think this is a great moment, and this is a very important moment for us to have some ethical framework, ethical principles that apply to the use of technologies in the country, and why not to one of the most disruptive technologies such as AI. And that's why we developed an ethical framework, and with the Development Bank of Latin America, we propose a framework that is now being shared publicly and discussed by the presidency of Colombia with different actors and governments in the region, so that we start building more trust into technologies. And that's something we believe it's essential in order for digital economies to have the impact that we all desire. So there, for example, what with Monica and what Fabian just mentioned, I think we all are concerned about the control that we have over all these economies. How are governments going to provide, I don't know, solutions to the problems that we have on these markets, to many of the inefficiencies that we can find, and how are governments going to solve many of these things? And for us, and for me, I think at least at the beginning, is that we have this ethical conversation at least, that we understand like which are the limits of these kind of technologies, how much we want to protect privacy, freedom, many of these principles in a new era that was also brought to us by COVID-19. And in that way, to set those limits to innovation, and those limits that we believe will help us to continue being human, continue to help us reduce inequalities, but at the same time, that will help us to create a better world and to find solutions to many of the problems we are facing. So there we have what we have in Colombia now is this discussion, and we hope that it's a very broad discussion with different groups and different entities from around the country and around the world about how we're going to face this emerging technology, the challenges brought by AI. At the same time, there are principles that I really like to highlight, and for example, are this element of human control. We believe that human control must still exist, even if we're talking about technologies that have a lot of automation and a lot of autonomy and the way they are used. We believe in the human over the loop, human in the loop, as essential elements to be considered, that we believe that technologies should not only do whatever they want, they should also be the objectives that we have. And while we are building a digital economy, we believe that digital economy will embrace the values that we put into that economy. So if we believe that, I don't know, privacy is relevant, I'm sure the digital economy should respect that. If we believe that human dignity is important, we also believe that it's going to be very relevant to the market we are creating. And I think with COVID-19, we are getting into those discussions more and more. And that's something I think, looking into the positive side, as I mentioned, I think, yes, that's something positive about all this terrible pandemic we had to go through. And at the same time that we are, yes, aligning our interests, aligning our values into the digital market that we want to build. And that's why, like, the document that we have now, the ethical framework that we are proposing, and that I know many other entities around the world are also proposing ethical principles for AI and many other technologies, are so relevant for the digital economy and are so relevant for the world we are building now, because we are deciding over the kind of protections, how are we going to build trust, and how are we going to tell people that these technologies are actually going to help them, are going to replace them, or are not going to destroy their works or destroy their society. And there on the other point, so for example, in Colombia, we had this case that there had been studies and projections that, for example, 2.5 million people who lost permanently their jobs because and their work because of COVID-19 and the use of new technologies such as AI. So there we have a big challenge, because people will see then AI as a threat for their lives, for their future. And that's what we want to show people, that's not necessarily the way this is going to work, that there are going to be some limits, that definitely we have to be conscious of the social consequences of implementing these technologies and these kind of digital solutions. And at the same time that we are training these generations and future generations to be prepared to have more job opportunities and to deal with a new labor market that requires new skills and disciplines, and that's something we are also making a big effort on. And I think, for example, in Colombia and many countries in Latin America, such as Peru, Chile, and Brazil, I know is also working on digital strategies, digital AI strategies also that allow these countries to be prepared, their populations to be prepared for what is coming. So those will be for now my remarks on your question, Negla, and yes, happy to hear from others.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I appreciate it. I'm actually going to go back to the panelists on this issue of work and skills. I would love to hear from you, the idea of the future of work, and now the discussion is very much there. There's always been, the idea of AI, machines taking over, technology taking over. Now with COVID-19, whether and how this has changed, I'd love to hear. I pick it up from Armando and hear from Fabian first, and perhaps then Monica. And if you want to comment on the ethical issues as well, because Armando has raised, a number of points as well, the idea of ethical side of the technology. So Fabian, would you like to start, and then we'll move on to Monica. Go ahead.
Well, thanks. That's a very interesting point. And if I may, I just quickly jump back to what Monica and Amanda said earlier. So I think Monica is perfectly right. I mean, it's of course there can't be any internet when there is no internet infrastructure. So this is definitely one of the reasons why, for example, we in our studies, when it comes to online labor markets, have so little evidence of what is going on and what the true potential, behind this veil of lacking infrastructure is actually in Africa. From the colleagues that I know, like Monica, but also colleagues that have been done fieldwork with entrepreneurial communities in Nigeria, for example, is that there is a huge potential, and once the infrastructure is there, the question will still be if this potential is going to unleash, because there's this funny saying among internet geographers: just because the internet is everywhere doesn't mean that the activity is nowhere. It is always clustered at specific places, and I think this activity, where it's then going to take place and where money is made and innovation is going to be facilitated, then really depends on, say, the human resources that are there, the education. But that's potentially leading us to maybe something that we want to discuss later. And what Armando said is really interesting, the aspect of trust when it comes to new emerging technologies, because you said that people really need to have trust in the technology. And an interesting point that we just recently found out with our research is that it also takes trust in the agency, in the institution trying to implement this kind of technology. So for example, we've been talking at the OII with the press about the implementation of this contact tracing apps. Now in times of COVID, that you try to monitor the potential spread of this pandemic. And a study that we conducted, even though just in a European framework, but I'm pretty sure it would also apply if we had the data to apply this on a global scale, that crucially the implementation of, let's say, of devices implemented by the government, all sorts of e-governance, but in particular when it comes to delicate issues of privacy data, health data, crucially depends on how much trust citizens have in this institution, that sense in the government. And the same holds if the institution is not a governmental institution, a private institution. In some settings, maybe the private institution is more trustworthy, actually, than at least perceived by those that want to apply the technology than the government. But coming back to what you just said about the ethical concerns, I think the ethical concerns when it comes to the how technology is changing our society. I'm not so keen, if I may say this, to talk about AI too much, because for me as a data scientist, it's the more I'll deal with what a lot of people call AI, the more vague this thing becomes to me, what AI really means. But let's say we talk about machines that learn, but also about technologies on a platform level, for example, platforms that now govern our everyday life, be it platforms that tell us where we could rent an apartment, or platforms that tell us if we are a freelancer where to find a job in this global gig economy. These technologies definitely, to use this broad definition of technology, definitely change our lives. And often I think when it comes to biases, ethical concerns and then to biases, of course, we talk about very important issues like, for example, racial biases that are often debated when it comes, for example, to the application of artificial intelligence, that some of the perceptions of the people that develop these technologies are then transferred and in the worst case potentially even amplified by the technology that they have created. And that is definitely something we should have an eye on. But if I may, I would actually like to point to a different type of ethical concern, of bias that might come up with the usage of technologies like online platforms, like gig platforms, for example, and that are network biases. And that is something that I want to address, because I think increasingly, as these technologies govern our life, less people are actually aware of these kind of network biases. What do I mean with that? If we, for example, look for a restaurant and we want to find a restaurant where to eat, and we're in a city that we don't know, we usually go to this very popular search engine provider and we type in Mexican restaurant, for example, and we find a list of restaurants and it gives us star ratings. And usually, I think if we're honest, we think we usually don't pick the restaurant that has less than, let's say, 4.5 stars, for example. We always go for the ones that have a very, very high rating. And the same, though, the more we are governed by platforms, this same dynamic applies to various domains of our lives, and very crucial domains. So much more crucial questions than just which Mexican restaurant to choose, but for example, which freelancer to hire. Is it a freelancer? Is it a person from Nigeria, or is it going to be a person from France that we're going to hire? And the same metrics apply. We have ratings, and these ratings kind of give us the information that we're seeking, at least we think that they do, but they are governed by network metrics that often actually put the person in a favorable position that was there first. And so they amplify this first mover advantage. They amplify the advantage of somebody who has already gotten a job, who has already gotten a reputation, and at the same time, unfortunately, pushing back the person who's the second mover or the third mover, or maybe the person that has never gotten a job online and has no reputation at all, will not be selected, will not get a reputation, and you see where the circle is ending. And I think this is particularly in the context of this, this glooming narrative that I still believe we should go after, that the internet had posed first in terms of development economics. This is a truly important aspect, I believe, because only if we manage to not only tackle these more prominent biases of AI technologies, but also maybe the less prominent biases of network technologies, of platform technologies, then that brings us a step forward to get closer to this ideal scenario of a community where people have equal chances to participate.
Thank you, Fabian. These are great insights. Thank you so much. This actually is a perfect follow-up on Armando's comments. And Monica, would you like to comment on the ethical aspects, the biases? Go ahead.
The funny thing is, in African governments, and I'm going to be very candid here, and maybe talk to the African governments, and hopefully they'll be listening at some point. But we have a challenge when it comes to data with Africa. On one hand, there's the idea that governments really is a big holder of data in the continent. They're the ones who really hold a lot of data. And so on one hand, you have African governments encouraging technological access to data, but on the other hand, you're also seeing control of that very data. And you see this in very interesting ways across the continent. You will see that on one hand, the idea of maybe having my ID card is digitalized, but another part of the system isn't digitalized, say my passport. In Kenya, in the case of Kenya, your passport is digitalized, and I really want to highlight the fact that in Kenya we do have a good digital system, but nonetheless there has been fear created with data. And so for African governments, the question we have is, how do you encourage trust with data? Because while African governments are beginning to go online and asking us to have all our documents online in the data systems, the citizens themselves don't have trust with the African governments. And so you begin to see the question about how do we build trust? So the question in Africa is a trust question. And how do African governments create trust among its citizens? And these are issues that must be resolved in Africa because, you know, there's fraud and there's trust, and that must be put in place. And then of course we have, you know, data misuse, and people scared about data misuse in Africa, and especially with government, with elections. And so, you know, as we think about digital, we are going into an election season across Africa in the next 2 years, and across most of the countries in Africa, we will be in election time. And when we talk about digital, we saw in the case of Kenya, where our last elections were done online, and, you know, and I voted with an online digital system, and I went and, you know, used the technology. But of course, there's fear about how that data was actually used and the trust around that. So there's issues of data misuse, and we think about this in Africa in relation to elections, especially within sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, the other issue on ethical concerns is in disinformation. And, you know, while many governments have set up portals, opened up toll-free lines, WhatsApp channels, you know, there's also questions about access to that data. We're beginning to see governments put in policies in place to be able to check your data. And so, you know, there's a concern, and I really, you know, like the work that Armando and Fabian have just talked about in relation to the fact that we must question the ethics about that. How safe is my data? Whose data is it in the first place? And how do I, and, you know, well, you know, we may think these are only Western questions, but they are now becoming as important and fundamental for us in Africa, especially as we move online, because we're not really asking the hard questions before we go online. How do we access that data when I want it? Whose data does it become after? How is it going to be used long-term and in the future? And so as we see governments putting in legislative measures to deal with this information, for example, in South Africa, you know, they passed on the Regulation Criminalizing Act. And we also see in Kenya the same thing, you know, cyber crimes has been, you know, now you can prosecute. And in fact, this very day I saw a comment of our president actually wanting to have a new head for data. So there is a sense in which data is becoming important among African countries, but I think for me, the ethical question and concern is not only on the owners of the applications in terms of the safety of our knowledge and whose knowledge, but also the responsibility of African governments in creating a trust ecosystem for us to be able to put this data. I think I wanted to just really highlight that when it comes to the ethics of data.
Thank you, Monica. I want to go back to Armando in talking about data, because you, again, going back to the AI framework that you did for Colombia, to what extent are issues do resonate with you? The issues of data biases, data blindness, who's covered by data, who owns the data, you know, who are the similar people who are presented differently, or different people who are presented similarly in the data. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit, especially after COVID-19. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So no, very interesting point. Well, from what Monica and Fabian said, I think I would like to say that also there is a matter of transparency and explainability that have been very, very complicated to deal with, especially, for example, transparency just with this point that Negra mentioned about the data. Yeah, transparency about the purposes of data used, how data is being used, but at the same time about explainability, because these systems are turning to be more and more complex, and at the same time it was difficult and more difficult to explain how they work. And the thing now with COVID-19 is that these technologies are affecting a big part of the population, and a big part of the population that we have noticed in Colombia and for example in other countries in the region here in Latin America, that lack the basic skills to understand what is going on, and even to understand how their data is going to be used, for example. So we can tell them that it is going to be used by, I don't know, by an AI system that is going to do X or Y for X or Y purpose, and people will not be able to understand many of these things, even if we are very transparent about what we are doing. So, of course, there we have a big challenge, and it's how we're going to provide all that knowledge, provide explainability, and provide information that is comprehensible for a big part of the population now that is interacting in this digital world. About the data, well, you know, that's a big discussion, of course, and I think that what we have to be very conscious about is that I think there are new regulations now. Well, of course, GDPR is not that new, for example, but it's a very interesting one that has created a lot of interest around the world about the use of data. Now it's being under pressure because of all these things we have seen during the pandemic. And I think, but for me at least, and in the perspective of developing countries, I think we need to find some balance. some balance between the protection that we need, of course, and the access to data that is also very important to find solutions to many of the things that we have been going through the pandemic. And as you know, many of the solutions are also with the use of data, with geolocalization, with having access to all this data that also can provide many solutions to governments and to reduce the impact of the pandemic. So there, I think it's a matter of creating some kind of balance. As I go back to this point, creating, of course, trust on the agency. I agree with what Ferina said, and I think this is also a matter of governance, building a proper governance that allows people to see that there is also a balance of power, that the entities collecting all this data will be under some control, that will be even under citizen control. So I think that's essential. And for me, that's, I think, the new challenge that we have now. How are we going to build schemes that allow to protect basic principles such as privacy and basic rights such as privacy, but at the same time that will encase and allow data to be accessible and to have a lot of access to data. So there are many different models being proposed. So for example, I can talk about one that is data trusts. There has been a lot of discussion now about data trust, and I think the European market also wanted to create data trust in order to increase the access to data, but at the same time, which GDPR, that is complying with GDPR and GDPR standards. So that's something worth of mentioning and actually looking at this new world. And of course, we have to have some kind of governance control and citizens control over the way that their data is being used. But for me, that's also a matter about being transparent and at the same time allowing that transparency to provide some clear explanations of what is going on until the point that we can understand. I don't want to reduce the complexity of technologies and on platforms right now, but I think we can do a better effort on explaining people how all these technologies are working right now. So for me, yeah, those are the points we have to deal with in this data world now that we live going through.
Thank you, Armando. I'm going to jump in to the last question because I'm seeing a lot of questions coming through the Q&A. I'm going to leave the future of work and skills to the Q&A because I see a question about them. And I'm going to use my, take advantage of the time left for us here to sort of jump to my last question here. What is the top challenge that you see in this story of the digital economy, after COVID-19? Inclusion, what is the challenge that is facing different, countries, communities to inclusion, to development, to well-being? And if you have policy advice in that direction, what is really the #1 challenge that's facing us today, especially pushed by COVID-19 in this framework? And I will start by Monica, if I may, and then move the other way. Go ahead.
Oh, interesting that you began with me, but all right, I will go straight into it. I think I highlighted, I think our top challenge is access and affordability. So in Africa, we've really got to go. It seems like it's a basic thing, but I'm going to keep pushing that angle because the top challenge is if we can get the infrastructure, access and affordability must come with it. And for African governments, this means I always use myself being out here in the countryside, away from main city sort of stereotype. And the fact that I really always have to think through what my network is, and the fact that I can access this on a mobile data phone, which is what I'm using, and the cost of that for me to be online is a very, very key thing. And then of course, duty exemptions. We must, as African governments, provide duty exemptions, especially on laptops, phones, smartphones, tablets, just lowering the cost to reach internet access. We must always think, I think, in terms of infrastructure, access, and cost. That must be the song we must sing, because if we have those 3 ducks lined up, I think a lot of things become easier to get in. The second thing I want to highlight, especially for me with Africa, the African continent, is to give and then take. African governments have had an urge, especially because of COVID, to want to fast take. And so you're beginning to see a lot of tax being put in on a lot of digital things. If you look at South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, I don't know about Egypt, but Tanzania, Mauritius, Uganda, you're beginning to see, a lot of incentive to want to implement unilateral direct or indirect taxes around a lot of the digital goods and services. And what does that mean for us? It means it's going to cost more than to be online. It's going to cost more for businesses, especially small and medium enterprise businesses, to go online. So we need to think through the question of taxing. And then I think thirdly, governments, especially with the regulatory burden, needs to be questioned. I always say, my background is ICT and technology and regulation. And I always say that regulation only exists until you should have no, the idea is for no regulation. That's the aim of regulation, to be no regulation. So, but you see, we're beginning to see African governments begin to regulate innovation. And we want to allow innovation to exist without regulation for a while, because that's how innovation grows. If you look at M-Pesa, for example, in Kenya, it grew because of the lack of regulation around it. And so we must begin to encourage African governments to allow innovative solutions from their people, from their citizens, to exist without the regulatory stick right next to it whenever a new innovation is brought up. And we begin to see this. So really thinking through guidelines around that. And also, the third thing is we're beginning to see cash transfer, and cash transfer is the norm in Africa, especially in countries like Eastern Africa, who have gone onto mobile. South Africa and the Eastern African countries were using a lot of the mobile money cash transfers. We need to think about the regulation of costs around cash transfer. It's the easiest thing to do. It's great for the fact that I absolutely carry no cash and all cash is on my phone. It's the best and most brilliant thing in the world, I think, but we need to think through the cost of what is paid per transaction on this cost. I really want to highlight that. And then of course, lastly, education. We have seen that we've got our education systems across the continent have got to be willing to change and to be innovative and creative. And we've got to be able to move the box away from what we've always done and say COVID-19 is, as I always say, a free change consultant. So if it is a free change consultant, let's use it. It's a free change consultant, and it has no bias. And so we've got to begin to say, let's see how we can allow the education systems, which have been very wrought, to be creative. And how do we do that, especially with technology? I'm going to stop there, allow you to talk, and then I'll jump in after.
Thank you, Monica. Then I'll move to Armando. So what do you think is the top challenge, and what is the policy advice that you suggest?
Yeah, I think that, this was such a rapid change but we have to be conscious that the digital world is now the real world, and that we are experiencing now a new reality. So, and we have to read our reality now from a digital perspective. So for example, when we're talking about governments, talking about literacy, yes, learning how to read and write and things like that. But literacy now is things such as coding, knowing how to connect a laptop to a printer, things like that. That could be very basic, but at the same time, challenging for countries such as in Colombia. We have a lot of deficiencies on digital skills, for example. So we cannot consider that literacy is just going to be just those basic things that we look at the physical and in the real world that are going to turn into the digital world. So I don't know, inequalities, for example, are not going just to be measured. For example, if women have access, I don't know, to work, but if women have access to coding programs first. That's the other way of measuring inequality now that we have to be aware of. And I think that that's our main challenge, to show countries that that our reality has changed, that we are living now in a digital world, and that the metrics that we used before to measure the physical and the real world, let's say, is not, now we have to translate them into those of the digital world into that. Into this kind of measures. So definitely that's challenging, because of course we used to have a long tradition of looking at things in a very different way, but this is the pandemic changed that for all of us. We know labor laws, for example, have changed. Now we're talking about labor laws in platforms, labor laws for people working at home, and things like that are going to become essential and more relevant than before. So yeah, definitely. I think those are the challenges. So I think that for policymakers, I will try to show them the importance of learning more and more about technology and the digital changes that are coming, how necessary it is to build multidisciplinary groups, not only, for example, and in the case of policymakers, not only bring into the table experts, I don't know, on economics or regulation or law, but at the same time of data science and many other disciplines in which before they don't seem to be relevant to policy making, but I think they are now. And that's why I think this traditional approach that we had to many of these things will have to change. And I hopefully we have more of a multidisciplinary exchange. We have more of a multidisciplinary conversation and dialogue. And definitely we start changing many of the structures that we had before, because yeah, the traditional structures have changed, I think, yeah, for now on, and that will be the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Armando. Now I turn to Fabian. Yes, your call.
Big question. I think I would go for an evergreen: education, 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 education. For the following reasons. So, since this talk is a lot about COVID, I think COVID is, I think Monica said, what was it, a free of charge consultant or something similar to that? Yeah. So COVID is definitely a facilitator of trends that we have already seen. Most prominently, I think, of the digitalization of things. And that brings us to the topic of automation. I think the more digital technologies progress, the more this big trend of automation of certain tasks is going to progress and to invade many more spheres of our lives that we're currently aware of. I think contrary to a common perception, and this is also kind of an evergreen in economics, this fear of mass unemployment, of mass automation of jobs. I think it's a lot about the automation of specific tasks. That is something that we have to think of, and that brings us to a situation that we have jobs, and that is definitely going to be facilitated by digitalization, and therefore also by the current situation with COVID, that the composition of certain professions, the task composition of certain professions from an economist's point of view is going to be reshuffled again and again and again and again. And that brings us to a very, very paradoxical situation, which is the new jobs that emerge with new they have new task compositions, they have different task compositions, task requirements, skill requirements than the jobs that maybe have vanished. And that brings us to the very paradoxical situation that we have unemployment to a certain degree at the same time, together with demand for labor that has this new kind of skill composition. And that is something that has been going on for quite some time, and that will definitely be accelerated, not only because of COVID-19 and the economic repercussions, but the good thing, to put it in a positive perspective, the acceleration of digital technologies also enables us with a lot of opportunities to address this challenge. And that is, for example, one example is why major, media broadcasting or music providers are flourishing, because they perfectionized a technique which is called debundling and rebundling. You can now listen, you don't have to, so back in the days, if you wanted to listen to one Rolling Stones song, you had to buy the whole album, and then all of a sudden you could download the single song, and now you can rebundle them again with other songs. So if you want to listen to the Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd and Deep Purple, you pay whatever, $9 a month, and you get this from this famous providers. But the thing is, this also applies with skills, with education. So we have unique opportunities thanks to digital technologies of reskilling, upskilling, and also cross-skilling. So combining skills from bundles that have been previously detached from each other. So you can do now, where you have been doing boring statistics before, you combine it now with machine learning, and boom, you're a data scientist and everybody wants to hire you on the labor market. I mean, maybe it's not that simple, but that's kind of the pathway, the opportunity, and we need to make a policy recommendation. We need to think of that. We need to make this be ingrained in our educational systems, that this cross-skilling, agile cross-skilling, so the opportunity of removing and adding new things to your skill bundle, that this is really what makes the difference for you to have a fulfilled professional perspective, both from a personal perspective, but also from an economic perspective. And that is something that really education providers and then also governments need to pay attention to, I think.
Thank you very much. These are great insights from the three of you. And on a selfish note, my students are in the audience, and I'm very happy because they're hearing things that we discuss in class. So I'm just so happy to hear, you know, these wonderful insights. And let me then use the time that we have, because we're having a whole, you know, a set of questions. We're trying to curate them. So I'm going to do my best. I'm going to read 3 questions at a time, and I'm just going to go for the speakers, you know, and you can pick whichever you'd like to answer to. Actually, the first is related to labor markets. And it says, how can we ensure the sustainability of the positive changes in labor markets brought up by the pandemic? We spoke about the fragmentation. So how can we ensure that we can capitalize? I think perhaps Fabian spoke to this a little bit about the idea of agile cross-skilling, but this is a question that came and it was sort of brought up. So if any of the panelists would like to speak to. Another question is, how do we respond to tech pessimism, AI and emerging technology? There is constantly, and this is a narrative that we are used to, the tech pessimism. Where do we look for assurances with regard to the positive impact of technology, especially the ethical ones? So this is another question. And then a third question to Dr. Macau: should we expect African governments, both at individual and inter-region levels, to step in and facilitate the growth of digital economic indicators, such as the internet connection, in a bid to bridge inequalities, or should we let the private sector take a head on? So these are the 3 questions. I'll take these 3. So Monica, would you like to start, and then we'll go into.
Let me start and sort of say, you know, we're no longer in a world of silo. And so we cannot afford to have private sector being the only person running the show. We also cannot afford government to be. And I think we must always think about the entire ecosystem of government and private sector in partnership together, and the citizens in partnership together in thinking about technology and access. Okay. And so I think I don't expect, you know, a separation of that thought process. I expect a coming together of that process. Of course, private sector is always going to go to places in Africa where, of course, you know, incentive for profitability is going to be at its, you know, biggest highlight. And so government must step in to think about incentives to allow them to access places they wouldn't otherwise go. And we must do this. And African governments must say, we must ensure that as private sector must be in places which are not economically viable to them, but viable to the economy in the long run. And so, you know, that combination of both working together and thinking through the planning. And we have seen, you know, things in Africa, problems where, you know, you've seen access fiber laid out by government. And I'm not going to mention the number of governments where I've traveled around and seen, you know, fiber laid out, amazing, fantastic fiber, but then it's not being used. And then you see private sector laying out fiber in the continent. That's a lot of money. You know, wasted around because, you know, of not working and thinking together. And so there must be re-questioning around the thought process. If a private sector company is going to a place, we must work. And I also, you know, I want to highlight the fact that, you know, today, you know, access and infrastructure for us in Africa also has to use the power lines. We've got to use everything available with, you know, infrastructure today to make it possible for people to access, you know, access. And we must be able to work across. So while, you know, Fabian was talking about digital skilling, I think we must also work across public sectors, across the different institutions, and not think about telecom companies on their own, but think about companies per se, because we are seeing, even in mobile money and everything, that it is not, you know, mobile money is not only owned by, you know, the banking sector, and it's now owned by anybody who can afford to get access into and run a mobile money platform. So it's the same case for infrastructure.
Thank you, Monica. Fabian, would you like to take a question, especially, I guess, the follow-up question on the labor market? How can we ensure to get positive impacts of this? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm happy to do that. That's a good one. I think when it comes to this perspective of cross-skilling, you know, this debundling and rebundling opportunities of skills that we have right now, the challenge is, but at the same time, the big opportunity is that this is no one-size-fits-it-all approach. I'm not saying that we should all become data scientists right now. of course, on a macro level, there's a huge demand for this right now, and everybody who has this notoriously famous job title is now probably in a good position. But I think it really comes down to the individual. And if I may, I would just like to relate to a piece of research that we're just conducting, because what the data that we have, this data about of freelance market, online freelance market, allows us to do is to actually have a look at how the economic benefits of learning a new skill look like, and not only in a specific country, but around the world in different positions. And I think it's very valuable. What we see right now is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and it really depends on the skill bundle that you already have. You know, it might be profitable to learn skill A if you are a professional translator, for example, but while it might be much more profitable for you to learn skill B if you're an engineer engaged in 3D printing, for example. But the unique opportunity to leverage these technologies best, and to implement sustainable and individually sustainable practices on the labor market, is to actually look at these individual skill profiles. And if I may, I would just like to advertise for the project that we're trying to build up, which is a cross-skilling compass, which is exactly that, trying to, you tell me who you are, what is your skill bundle, what did you do, what maybe is your formal education, what do you learn in university or in school, and we try to leverage on this online data and tell you, this might be an interesting skill for you that fits your skill portfolio, and that can leverage, economically leverage on what you already know. We're right now in the process of looking also for partners, institutional partners. So if there are people interested in logistically and let me say this openly, also financially willing to support and have a look in this with us, please feel free to reach out.
Great, thank you, Fabian. Armando?
Yeah, well, on the point of the technological pessimism, I think that definitely in the world we are going through, there are many challenging things, but one we should be a little bit more optimistic about is technology. Technology is helping us to continue with our lives, to connect, to have these kind of workshops, to find solutions to what is going on. Well, it's amazing, for example, here in Colombia, many of the things we are trying to do to face COVID-19 challenges that are using technology, that are using AI and many other technologies. So I think there are many reasons to be optimistic about. Of course, we are concerned about many things, but I'm also optimistic, for example, for the ethical discussions. Even when the ethical discussions sometimes try to be pessimistic and try to show like the risks of AI and the need for some limits, I'm optimistic about that because, for example, the ethical discussion is allowing us to have a very important debate about basic principles that I think all our societies were missing. And it's about what we understand about privacy, discrimination, freedom. And I'm very optimistic about the results that we're going to obtain from there. We're going back to that kind of conversation, and that's something I really value. And it is also turning into a global discussion, and that's also something that I think it's very good and very positive, and something to be optimistic about, because this is not turning into a conversation, for some specific regions of countries, but all the world, and because of the disruptive effect of AI, and because we are all experiencing, for example, AI, the internet, and all these new technologies and their impact, we are all going into this conversation and trying to provide our voice. And that's also increasing a lot of the efforts that have been made in the last years for more inclusion in these kind of dialogues. So I'm very optimistic about that. I think even when the ethical conversation tries to deal and address some concerns that we have, we can be optimistic that even that exercise is a good exercise. For me, also, I think that we need to do an additional effort to try to show more of the benefits of AI, and especially because we want, and I can tell you this from the Colombian experience, what we are trying to do is to have more of a cost-benefit analysis and the way in which we are building these policies. And we will not be true to ourselves, and we will not do a good cost-benefit analysis if we are just highlighting the costs and the risks of the technology. We also have to show the benefits, and we also have there to balance the way we are analyzing these technologies and the way we are approaching to these technologies. So in that way, I think yeah, we cannot turn into super enthusiastic, take an optimistic mood or a negative or or tech pessimism as it was addressing the question. But I think that what we should do is balance, and at the same time to look at how technology can help us solve many things if it is kept under control. If it continues to embrace human values and to respect human dignity, and that's something we can be optimistic of all the discussions that we're having at this, and for example, this very interesting dialogue that we have had today.
Thank you very much, Armando. I have a question interesting about the environment. And it says, how will digitalization and datafication impact cross-cutting policy challenges in developing countries where the discourse on e-waste, environmental impacts of e-commerce, and sustainable energy, to name a few, are not included in the digitalization discourse? This is one. And a second question about the global balance of power. The idea of the globalization with the inequality, the digital economy creating inequality, but what if COVID-19, is it actually allowing an opportunity for the closer convergence in knowledge production, in collaboration in different aspects globally? So the global balance of power and the environment, e-waste, environmental impacts. Thank you. Who would like to go first? Armando, would you like to go first?
I would like to go first. My colleagues have been first, and let me say, well, go first with this one. I think it's very important. This aspect of the environment has turned to be quite interesting because we don't always see the connection. It is not a very clear connection between the digital world, how it is going to affect the environment. But of course, it has a lot of impact. And of course, it's building a new kind of consumer. It is increasing consumption of many products, and we have to be aware of that. So I think the connection is more direct than what we have imagined. And in that point, I think that definitely what we need to look at is at the social benefit that we are creating with e-commerce and with all these technologies, and how are we going to also at the same time address the costs and the social costs that we are creating. And for me, that's something that definitely should be part of a previous impact assessment in the way in which we deal with technologies and in the way in which we want to implement some of the technologies we are having right now. Also, as I said, I think we have to be aware of the way in which e-commerce is going to, and for example, other technologies are going to improve production and create even more efficiencies, but at the same time, they can sacrifice our resources and increase the consumption of resources. And how are we going to increase consumption of e-commerce that is going to, yes, well, turn our demand and turn in exponential numbers, but at the same time, the effect this can have in the environment. And that's something that we can address if we have some kind of, first, an ethical approach to these things, of course, and also if we start taking more into the labor of gathering evidence that will build a policy in which technology is also used in a responsible manner that will protect the environment. And as I mentioned at the point of networks, I think definitely these kind of workshops, what we're doing, the way we are sharing experiences, and all as humans, we are sharing the same problems and challenges, has been quite interesting this time of the pandemic. And I think the internet has been an essential platform for all of us to show that we are, of course, diverse, different, we live in different cultures, but that we are facing the same problem and that we are together in all this. And it's amazing, for example, how we see a lot of people from very different countries or cultures showing that they're facing the same problems, and we feel identified kilometers, miles away from each other, but we feel that that's what we are going through, and we feel that we're sharing all that knowledge and all those experiences because of the internet and because technology has allowed us to do that. For me, the only thing is that, and I think Monica mentioned already, is that we are able to share as many experiences as possible, and that we are able to expand connectivity and to bring connectivity to a lot of populations so that we can share more and more as humans, and not just for those that have a good connection and good networks and good connectivity. So definitely that's something that we still have the challenge to, because as I said, this is the world, this is what we are going to look at. Future generations are going to connect to the world in a big manner through the internet, And we want to show how diverse is the world, and that's why connectivity and all these policies are so important for yes, to provide this kind of diverse perspective of the world, and to provide more and more inclusion that is essential in this kind of moment, and in this kind of conversations, and especially in this moment. Yeah.
Thank you, Armando.
I'm gonna go next, Nagla, and just sort of say first, I see our listeners here asking the question, and Research ICT Africa, for those who know it, I work with them as I serve on the board with them, but Research ICT Africa has done a lot of work around Africa and the ecosystem of digital and what it means for Africa. So I encourage us to really look at some of their work there, and there's some interesting work that RIA has done across the continent, across the different countries on the issues of digitization and the issues around what it means for infrastructure, what I spoke about at the beginning, infrastructure, access, and cost, because for us in Africa, infrastructure, access, and cost are really a big part of it. But I want to highlight something about digitization and the issues that it's facing around And I think we must begin, especially for Africa, and I guess it's the same for the rest of the world, but we must begin to rethink our framework around how we think about digital. It has originally always been a silo ecosystem. So ICT people talking to ICT, just generally you talk the language to the same people. And we must move to where we are talking across. And and how do we do that in operations, in day-to-day practice of government, and how governments have always been inherently silo and bureaucratic? Because if we're going to deal with socio-economic development issues and technology, then we must be willing to allow technology to pervade conversations across every sector. And to do that, everybody must be at the table. And I can't remember whether it was Amanda or Fabian who said, but everybody must be at the table. And that has to change our policy framework. And really, when we think, whether we're talking about agriculture, whether we're talking about health, we have to think that ecosystem across digital being across everybody. So I really want to start by just highlighting the fact that we must think cross-cutting rather than in silos in our thinking. And then, of course, COVID-19 has highlighted the fact that for us in Africa, we can speak for ourselves. And that's important. I see, Alison from South Africa can speak. There are many Africans ready to speak and have their work. And we tend to always go, we've had pre-COVID, have always gone to the West to speak about us. And I think this is part of what COVID has done. It has allowed Africans, Nagla in Egypt, to speak, and AK2 to speak from within the continent. And that's important because the voice of the continent isn't often heard. And the voice of the continent, when it's heard, is heard through research, and I'm not critiquing research, it's heard through research done outside the continent. And so it is important that we begin to encourage, which is why I'm really proud of the work by RIA and others in the continent and AK2, because it's research being done from within the continent, by the continent, about the continent. And so I think COVID-19 has highlighted that, and I think that's a brilliant thing that it has done.
Thank you, Monica. Fabian, would you like to respond with a few words? Because we have 5 minutes. I'm happy to, let's listen to your comments, and then I'll take a couple of minutes to wrap up. Please, Fabian.
Okay, I'll try to speed up. So, but let me quickly say, I absolutely second Monica. So I've been working with a lot of, I myself have not, unfortunately, engaged with a lot of internet research focused on the African continent, but I have a lot of fellow internet researchers, particularly, for example, Mark Graham with the Fair Work Foundation. They did, and they all would second with what you said. It's extremely valuable to have these insights come from within these communities and from within the continent, rather than being done by researchers that come from outside, from Europe, or for example from the United States. But to get quickly back to these two questions that you mentioned, so the first one, the sustainable or environmental impacts of the dynamics that we discussed. I'm not an expert not at all on environmental impacts, unfortunately, but I'm, as you might have figured out, a great enthusiast of using internet data to tackle these problems, and sustainable development goals, for example, is one of them. So and there I would like to again second Monica, because I think that's a great thing that you said. The thinking of silos is over. We cannot afford thinking in silos and working in silos anymore. So when tackling, for example, issues like the sustainable development goals, environmental issues, it is crucial to form partnerships between governments, NGOs, private companies. And the thing is, what we try to do is to help and facilitate this process by giving the agenda for certain development goals, sustainable development goals, a fingerprint of technologies, because we were able to use online data and look at what is being discussed, what is being needed for sustainable development goals, for certain goals, and to cross-check this with the technologies that certain companies have that are pursuing these goals. And we realized that there seems to be a certain set of technologies that is most applicable for private companies when they want to tackle, let's say, for example, issues of water quality, for example, Sustainable Development Goal 6, if I remember correctly. And this can really serve, I think, as a good guideline for these collaborations, from these breaking up silo collaborations that Monica mentioned. And just as a quick side note on this, the global balances of power, I think the big challenge is really the rising power of internet monopolies when it comes particularly in e-commerce, that are fueled by processes that I mentioned earlier, by these network and feedback effects. Because it's not only that within platforms people might be favored that have, you know, a good rating and a good reputation that has been accumulated, but it's also on a bigger level. It's that these specific platforms gain a huge advantage from the data that they've been gathering, and that they've been using to facilitate and to tune the machine learning processes and data science processes that allow them to acquire even more customers and even more, you know, tune the algorithms that they have. So this is an extreme preferential attachment, and that needs to be taken care of. Definitely. So a colleague of mine, for example, just to make a quick recommendation, Victor Meyer-Schönberger at the Oxford Internet Institute, they've been doing really interesting work on how to break this cycle that would in the end make a few companies very, very, very powerful. And I think this is something that we actually do not want for various societal reasons, I think.
Thank you very much, Fabian. We have very little time. This is a brilliant conversation. We have so many questions, so many points raised by the three of you and by the audience, but unfortunately we're out of time. So let me just wrap by saying I have learned from everyone. We have had a fantastic conversation. I want to thank Armando, Gayo Espanyol, our speakers, Fabian, Stephanie, Monica, Karatz Macau in no special order. I'm very, very grateful for your participation. Thank you for your insights. And I hope that this will be a start of a conversation that we continue to have with you and with everyone else. I'm super grateful to FES Egypt, Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung, and forgive the pronunciation, my German is not very good. Thank you, Richard, and your team. And I'm very also grateful to my team at the Access to Knowledge for Development Center. Just the last note that this is precisely research on the ground, a voice from Egypt, from Africa, from the Arab world is our mission. This is precisely what we have been doing at the Access to Knowledge for Development Center, which gives us a great opportunity to work with wonderful people like you. So what remains for me is to thank you all so very much. I look forward to further conversation. Have a great day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you all very much. And thanks A2K4D team. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.